Today we talk about Michael Upchurch, the indentured servant. In a previous video we have told about how he came to America in 1638 from England as an indentured servant, but now we need to turn to whatever that means to us, since all American Upchurches descended from this Michael Upchurch I. We need to pay attention to what the conditions were when he arrived in England. What better place to start than to look at cousin Etta Bell West's book on the Upchurch family. I call her the patron saint of the Upchurches because she did such a fantastic job along with her colleagues in publishing this little book about the Upchurch family in 1972. I'll just read a paragraph or so since she got the stuff all together. This is part 2 of her book, entitled Upchurch Family in Virginia, 1650 to 1750, Michael Upchurch. She writes, "It is not known when nor under what plan Michael Upchurch emigrated to Virginia from England. He was listed in Nell Nugent's Cavaliers and Pioneers, Abstracts of Virginia Patents and Land Grants, 1623 to 1666, by 2 different persons as a headwright when they were granted land in 1654. His name appeared on the list of Valentine Patton when Patton was granted 1,000 acres in 1654 in Westmoreland County, Virginia." Now, the story is that he is listed twice then as a headwright. Now, what they meant by headwright is that every person who arranged for a person to come to this country was granted 50 acres of land. Now, in this case, apparently there was a little skullduggery going on because he got claimed twice. So skullduggery was alive and well way back then. However, the places that are mentioned here, like Westmoreland County, are not necessarily places where Michael Upchurch ever lived. These headwrights were traded like script, and a person could buy 10 headwrights and establish 500 acres of land by simply purchasing those rights from someone else. Now, the situation is that the headwright situation was different from being an indentured servant, in that you had an indentured servant who had agreed to come to this country for the payment of his wages and to serve 7 years normally in order to pay back his passage. So there were 2 components to the transportation of the individual. One was the headwright, which was broken off and sold like script, and the other was the indentured himself, who body and soul came and had to serve his 7 years. Let's look at some other references which tell us about indentured servants, because we have essentially no facts beyond what I have just told you about the nature of his personal indentureship. So we have to rely on what people can tell us about the history of indentured servants back in that time. And here's an article I have in my files in the Indentured Servants, written in 1988 in the Orlando Centennial in Florida. It says, "Did ancestors arrive in bondage?" Now, the reason I turn to a little article like this is to remind everyone that whatever we say about the Upchurch family, the real stuff is found in the Upchurch collection at North Carolina State University. So 50 years from now, when someone goes to study Michael Upchurch or indentured servants of the 2, that person will find this sheet of paper there to refer to. Well, what does this tell us? It starts out by saying about 50,000 men and women and children were forcibly transported from Great Britain to the American colonies between 1615 and 1776. Now, right away, get some information and some misinformation. It is information to me to learn that someone has figured out that there were about 50,000 people who fell under the indentured servant category. However, not all of these were forcibly transported. It is true that a component of those who came under this category of indentured servants were forcibly transported, either because they took them out of the jails and said, we don't want to feed you in England anymore, we're going to ship you to the colonies and they can take care of you over there, and if you serve your 7 years you'll be free. So they were forcibly transported to America, and others were forcibly transported to Australia. This article goes on to say that the servitude lasted from 5 to 14 years. It says as early as 1619 they were rounding up vagrant children in London and shipping them to Virginia. But I don't think Michael Upchurch was rounded up. He volunteered, in my opinion, to go. Here's what they say typically happened. They were promised at the end of his or her service a house, an axe, a year's provisions, and double apparel, that is maybe 2 suits or 2 pairs of clothing, and sometimes a few acres of land, plus the free passage, that is the passage they had already taken by coming to this country. Let's look at another book that is very useful. This one is entitled White Servitude in the Colony of Virginia, a heritage classic by James Curtis Ballagh, B-A-L-L-A-G-H. Now this was originally published in 1895 by Bert Franklin, but this little booklet is being republished in 2001 by Heritage Books, Inc. And if you're interested in the very specifics, the ISBN number is 0-7884-1707-X. I've studied this little book about the white servitude, and one of the things you learn from this is the indentured servant, or the white servitude, was more or less an interim procedure. It started out in the early 1600s, and over in the 1700s the preferred mechanisms of having labor was to acquire slaves. So the indentured servitude program sort of wore out and was discontinued over a period of about 150 years. But in this little book we have several little stories. One is that the contract that a master had over one of these servants, who was an indentured servant, could be sold and traded. So if he said, gee, I need some money, this servant has 5 more years left on his duty he has to perform, I'll sell it to Mr. Jones across the creek, who needs somebody to help him for the next 5 years, and I'll get the money. And they could also tell what would happen to him in their will. He said, if I die, I will that my daughter shall have the rights to the service of this individual. So we gradually learned something about the general nature of the indentured servitude. But it was true that these indentured servants still maintained their personalities. They were able to testify in court. Depending on the particular circumstance, they might be entitled to marry. They might be able to have a little garden on the side and make some money. And in some cases, they might even be able to buy their way out of servitude. So this is another little book that's very useful to tell us about indentured servants, and it goes into the Upchurch collection. Let me turn to yet another book which tells us something else about Michael Upchurch and his living in Surry County, Virginia in the early and mid 1600s. This book is by James D. Cornwolf, K-O-R-N-W-O-L-F. It's entitled Guide to the Buildings of Surry and the American Revolution. So it tells you a great deal about Surry County and those early buildings, and we know that Michael Upchurch was there. Now, the thing I'll tell you about this book is it's been damaged. We had a flood in our house, and the books I was collecting for the Upchurch collecting got damaged, as this one did. So someplace we got to scurry around in the grocery budget and find money to replace this book to go in the Upchurch collection. The particular thing I want to bring to your attention that's in this book has to do with the fact that people who were living near Michael Upchurch in Surry County, Virginia, were people having names of prominent families that came from England, from Huntingdonshire, just as Michael did. My point is that I suspect Michael had a better way to travel than most indentured servants. I suspect he knew some of these people and knew their families back in England. Now, he was not very high up on the totem pole, but maybe he knew of them, he knew there were leaders in the community, and he crossed paths with them perhaps from time to time. This is a subject for someone else to dig in more deeply, but this book is a good place to start. And I particularly want to pull out this fairly extensive map that exists. It folds out to be a triple page. And this, let me read you what this map is all about. It says, map approximations of patents and grants and transactions of land in Surrey County, Virginia before 1652. Now, isn't that amazing? Here we have this map about these transactions at about the time Michael Upchurch was living there. And if we turn over to the part of this map that has to do with Surrey County, we see notes here about places where he lived. Here's Bacon's Castle, and we know that was part of Michael's history. Here's another one, Lower Lawns Creek Church. That's a church that Michael was associated with. Now, if you look at the names of the landowners here, we don't see Michael Upchurch as a landowner, although he eventually did own some land. But the important thing about this is that we see other people. For example, here's not too far away is Roger Delkey. Now, when Michael was involved in the little tax rebellion, Roger Delkey came on board and gave testimony. So there was Michael and Roger Delkey closely associated, and we know the Delkeys came from England. Of course, we all know we made a big mistake when we jumped to the prospect that the wife of Michael was Delkey, which is not true. But Michael was closely associated with the Delkeys. But there are other names on this list and other documents that pertain to this. For example, the Colettes, the Reynolds, and other families that were prominent in Huntingdonshire, England, were also prominent here in this part of Surrey County, Virginia. So if someone wants to take up the quest of studying indentured servants or the conditions under which Michael lived in the 1650s, 1680s, 1680 era, he will find this as a good starting point, and hopefully by the time they're doing that, we'll have a fresh copy of this book in the collection ready for the person to have a look at. So I would say that Michael Upchurch didn't fare too badly. He made a good trade because in England he didn't have the chance of inheriting a lot. First of all, his father Richard didn't have a lot. So no matter what the rules were, he wasn't going to get very much. So he made a good deal when he came to the United States of America in 1638. He probably was associated with friendly people, with people that were helpful, and I suspect they didn't treat him too badly as some indentured servants were treated. Some were treated very harshly and unfairly. My guess is that Michael came out in a favorable way, and he soon worked himself through his indentureship and gained some land and was happily married and produced children from whom we descend. It's a pleasure to bring you this little story about Michael, the indentured servant.
Bye.